Hey guys, my name is Shayla Anthony, and I'm going to be telling you a little bit about a lesson that I did for a child who's a child with epilepsy. So first of all, my child's name is Jason. Jason is a first grade teacher, first grade student at elementary school. He has been diagnosed with epilepsy since he was about 2 or 3 years old. His mom's biggest concern was like his inability to focus and to stay on task throughout his lessons in school. His mom noted that he has great relationships with his friends and his family, so there's nothing really how could I say, atypical about his learning. It's just the fact that he is a child with epilepsy and he takes medication for his epilepsy. Other than that, his teachers haven't really complained about his grades being too low or his scores on his assessments being too low, but they were also a little concerned about his inability to stay on task and to focus. So, with that being said, I constructed a lesson about saving money for his age group. And to start off, there are some other children in the classroom with different learning abilities, but for the purpose of this case study, I'm focusing on Jason. And as I mentioned before, he's a first grade student. So each day there's about an hour and 45-minute allotted time for mathematics to go on in the classroom. And I thought it would be a really good idea to use the lesson that was given to us on Blackboard. So that lesson was saving money. Sorry. In the classroom, there are 30 children, 16 males and 14 girls. So for Jason, one of the accommodations for his IEP is that when given a direction, he'll repeat directions to ensure that he's understanding what the directions were. In addition to that, he'll follow my verbal directions and complete requested task assignment in a timely manner and with cooperation. And one of those ways that I was able to get him to stay on task was to give him a sign timer, and that timer, once you turn it, that means that your time is up, or you have this amount of time left to complete a task. And it worked really well for him because he kept looking at the timer to see if he was on task. He kept just letting me know, like, hey, Miss Shayla, I have this amount of time left. And so I thought it was a really good idea that I used it for him, and it worked. So what I want my children to learn by the end of this lesson is that there's a value for coins and pennies, quarters, dimes, and things of the sort. The outcome is that they'll be able to skip count by fives up to 100, count the money, like I said, the pennies, the nickels, the dimes, and the quarters. And then they'll definitely be able to define the amount of money. Some of the language that I want to use is like savings, money, economy, banks. Some prior knowledge is that, like, days before we started becoming familiar with the values of money, and I displayed what each coin was, but I used pretend money. So for example, a penny, I showed them a penny. A dime, I showed them a dime. A nickel, I showed them a nickel. And a quarter, I showed them a quarter. And so that lesson went pretty well. They were able to learn a little bit about the values of money. So today, or not today, but the lesson that I'm discussing, we did it a few days ago after, I already assessed their prior knowledge using what we learned before. Children were able to Sorry, guys. The children were able to then review what we discussed prior about the values of money. So to get their minds flowing and going, I started off the lesson by asking, have you ever wanted something so bad, but you just didn't have enough money for it? And I would allowed few students to tell me, like, hey, yeah, I had that experience. I wanted to buy a horse, something far-fetched, that they're obviously not able to afford. So I told them, I said, hey, listen, I bet if we did something special, we would be able to save enough money so that we can afford to buy, something like a horse. So next I told them today we're going to be learning about counting money and how we can save up enough money to buy something big. It may not be a horse, but it may be something like a bicycle, something reasonable that, they could actually save up enough money to get. And they were super excited to hear about how they can save money to get a bike or a video game or so on and so forth. Next, I told them that I was going to be reading them a story called The Chair for My Mother. And I showed them the front cover of the book. And I said, what do you notice about the front cover? I waited for a few students to share out about it. And they were, telling me what they noticed. After that, while reading the story, I said to them, who's telling the story and what's the big thing that they wanted to get in the story. So in this story, they wanted to buy a couch, but they didn't have enough money, so they were saving and storing money so that they could get the money for the couch. And I asked them, like, again, how did they get the money for the couch or for the chair? And some students were able, especially Jason, he was like telling me how they were able to save the money, what they did to save the money, and so on and so forth. After reading the story, I reviewed what it meant to save and the role of banks and how banks are important to us. Banks help us to ensure that we keep a certain amount of money in the bank so that we're not going below a certain limit. I asked multiple children ways that they could save, or ways that they think they can save, as opposed to using like a little piggy bank or a jar. And some students were telling me like banks and that they had their piggy banks. Next, I introduced them to this skip counting activity. Again, all of this I got from the lessons that we were suggested to use. I thought it was really cool because it works well, and I use my own wording and I change it around depending on the development of my children. So the skip counting activity, what it was in the story, the mother displayed like the paper roll money, and so I used that and I brought in the paper roll money and I said to the children, so when we use these, we're able to count the amount of money, so for example, if we were to put 50 pennies in a roll of paper, that would equal 50 cents. If we were to put 5 cents in here and we want it to go to 100, what do we need to do? So I started counting by five. I'm saying, okay, 1 penny is 5 cents, 2 pennies is 10 cents, 3 pennies is 15 cents. And so we went on and on and on until the children were able to eventually count with me. Some children still had a little trouble, but I expected them to do so because, this is a new introduction to something. And so my plan is, after this lesson, to continue to work on them with counting by fives. Finally, I encouraged them to work in groups as an independent activity and play this cash and carry activity. So what it was that they turned the cards over, and each card was worth a certain amount of money. So they had to, discuss that with each other. And so I also provided, like, my student Jason, I figured to keep him on task and to keep him interested, I gave him like the actual money, and I told him to match the money with the cards, and it worked perfectly because he was on task, he was interested, he was like so excited to show me like which coin equaled which value of money. Afterwards, like throughout the lesson, I was walking around asking questions, engaging with the students to see like what they remembered the values of the monies to be, and when and why they think it's now important to save their money. So for Jason, again, as I mentioned before, I gave him a sand timer. The sand timer helped to pace him throughout the lesson and throughout his activities. He was able to turn the timer over when I said, "Hey, we have 10 minutes left." So the sand timer had like 10 minutes in, and I said, "When the timer goes off, you know that we have to stop and move on to something else." And he was engaged. He was working on his task. He was like calling me over to show me that he was working on the task, which I thought was so exciting. So those were two of his goals, and I think by the end of the lesson, we were definitely able to meet some of those goals. We've reviewed at the end of the lesson. We reviewed some vocabulary words like savings, bank, money, and I think in the future, what I would do to make it interesting is maybe bring in some money from another country and show them that that money also has some kind of value and may not be in the United States, but in another country, this money has some value. Uh, some of the ways that I managed my class was by rewarding them with stickers, giving them charts, verbal praises, and things of the sort. Some assessment tools I used was the activity sheet, questioning, and just overall just monitoring how they were processing the information. And I think that's it. Thanks, guys, for listening.